Let's make a start. Good afternoon. My name is Ken Holmes from CertiKit, and welcome to our short webinar on management system objectives. As we go through the webinar, if you have any questions, please drop them in the conversation window, and I'll pick up as many as possible at the end. As I mentioned before, this webinar is being recorded and should be available shortly after the presentation on YouTube and other good channels. So before we dive into the subject of the webinar, I just want to give you a bit of information about CertiKit themselves and me personally. Okay, so CertiKit is a provider of document toolkits. So we help companies to achieve ISO certification in a number of different standards, mainly around standards such as ISO 9001, 14001, 45001, etc. So it's the management system standards that we're really interested in. We've been going about 12 years or so. And we have a lot of customers internationally. We've got more than 4,000 customers in their sort of compliance needs over that time. And we also specialize in data protection, if that's of interest as well. So our aim really is to make compliance easy, or easier than it otherwise would be anyway, if you didn't have a starting point for documentation, because that can often be a difficult thing with becoming certified. So let me give you a little bit about myself. I say I'm Ken Holmes. I'm the Managing Director of CertiKit. My background is really in IT, so I spent about 30 years in IT. And I'm the primary author of the range of toolkits. So we started doing our first one was ISO 20000 quite a while ago, and then we've expanded over a period of time. I have a number of different qualifications, mainly to do around information security. So as you'll probably see as we go through, my main onus is on information security rather than quality and so on. But I do have an appreciation of some of these things as well, partly because as a company, we are also certified to ISO 9001 and 27001, have been since 2015. So some of what I'm about to say is through obviously running that ourselves and helping other customers to achieve certification. So let's get into the subject area. What are we going to cover today? Please bear with me if I have to admit a few people to the lobby as well. It's just the way things work within this. But in terms of what we're going to cover today, we're going to firstly cover what is the requirement for objectives within the management system standards that we're talking about. What exactly does it say, and what do we need to do in terms of objectives? A bit about the difference between a business objective and a management system objective. They're not quite the same thing, and really just talk around really the shades of grey between the difference between the two things. We're going to talk about the fact that objectives should be SMART, and we'll come on to what SMART stands for. It's no surprise there. I'm sure you've all come across that many times before. We'll then go into some example objectives, because a lot of this is really about trying to visualize what would my objectives look like. So what I'm trying to do there is give some examples, and we can talk around the good and bad aspects of some of those examples. And then we'll talk about when to measure your objectives, when's a good time and how often, where you might find some inspiration for your objectives. It can be quite difficult, as we'll get into this in further detail, to work out what exactly your objectives should be. And some of the issues we're going to discuss are things around how many objectives should I have, what structure should my objectives have, how many am I expected to have, and that's one of the things that often sort of comes up, and what should they look like. And then we'll give a brief summary of basically what we said. And at the end, we'll cover any questions. If you do have any questions, as I mentioned before, please put them in the chat, and we can try to get around to those. Okay, so let's first talk about what is the requirement for objectives within these standards. And as I said before, we're talking about the management system standards. So particularly, we're talking about 9001 for quality, 14001 for environmental, 45001 occupational health and safety, and then we're into 27001, which is information security, and then a few of the others, 22301 business continuity, and 20000 IT service management. So the reason I mention all of those, and the reason why we can talk in general terms about objectives in all of those standards, is because there is this Annex SL format or high-level structure, or various other names it goes by, which ISO has been implementing over a period of quite a few years now. And what this means is that all of these standards that I mentioned basically have the same layouts, they have the same wording, they have the same headings, and the intention is the management system parts look very similar to each other. The reason for doing that by ISO is to make it easier to run multiple management systems in an integrated fashion, and so to widen the breadth of and applicability, basically, of management systems and the standards associated with them. Bear with me a second. Okay, so it's clause 6.2 in all of those standards that I mentioned, and the requirement basically says that management system, so that would be quality management system, quality objectives, or it could be information security objectives, it could be occupational health and safety objectives. Really, you sort of insert whichever standard that you're talking about here. Whatever the standard is, objectives and planning to achieve them is the heading of that. So there's key things in this already. So we're talking about objectives, but we're also talking about planning to achieve them. So you can't really see the objectives in isolation. You really have to see them in the context of how are you actually going to achieve them. So once you've actually worked out the definition of your objectives, we then need to consider how you're going to achieve that, and you need to have a plan, as we'll see. So the standards are basically saying the organization shall establish objectives at relevant functions, levels and processes for the management system. So again, it's interesting in terms of the exact wording here. So we're talking about establishing objectives, but we're talking about establishing them in several different places and in several different ways, potentially. There's a lot of choice around this. But basically, you could have objectives that are associated with functions. So by function, we're talking about kind of organizational units. So that could be finance, it could be manufacturing, it could be IT, etc. At different levels, so you could have a hierarchy of objectives as well. So we could be talking about high-level objectives, which are then sort of cascaded within the organization at increasing levels of detail to achieve the higher level objective at lower levels as well. And we may also have objectives to do with processes. So again, this is working out looking at the different processes you have within your organization. How successful are those processes in achieving what they're supposed to achieve, and how do we work that out when we have an objective and see if that objective is being met? Okay, so there's some more clues there. But what I would say is that this is a mandatory requirement of the standards. So if you want to become certified to any of the standards we're talking about, this is not optional. You've got to have some objectives, and you've got to do the things that are required to do with objectives that are listed within the standards. So it's not something you can omit. So we're stuck with this, I'm afraid. Although I say that it's a very useful tool for driving improvement, and that's really what this is all about. So objectives are all about continual improvement, which obviously is a big part of all of these standards, and it's about quantifying that continual improvement and setting some goals, targets. All of these terms are equally valid within the context of these management systems, and understanding whether we're being successful in driving improvement forward within the organization. So it also says in clause 6.2.1, objectives shall. So we have a shopping list here of things that the objectives need to comply with. So the first thing is that they must be consistent with the quality. So this is a 9001 quote, really, or equivalent. So it could be information security, it could be business continuity, etc. But they must be consistent with the policy, the relevant policy. So it's not acceptable to state one thing or one set of things in your policy and then have a set of objectives that are completely unaligned with what you said you're trying to achieve within your policy. So really, consistency is the name of the game, and what we're trying to present here is a way of achieving the things that the policy says. The policy is a high level aspirational or statement of exactly where the organization is going and what the organization believes, and objectives are a way of implementing those things within the organization. Objectives must be measurable, so we have to be able to put a number against them, whether it's a number or some kind of indication of progress or level. We have to be able to sort of say whether it's gone up, it's gone down, is it meeting the criteria, and so on. So that's a key thing that the standards require to have done. Must take into account applicable requirements. So requirements are obviously a big thing in all of these standards. We're really talking about requirements from a number of different sources. So we could have legal and regulatory requirements. So in terms of personal data and GDPR and so on, that could be one. Requirements also will come down to your interested parties. So you will have done a lot of work in terms of clause 4 context and so on, and establishing the internal and external issues relevant to the management system. And part of that is establishing who your interested parties are and their requirements. So really going back to that, again, that's a good source of understanding perhaps where some of your objectives should come from. If you have key interested parties and they have specific requirements, then you may want to be able to measure whether you are meeting those requirements, because at the end of the day, that's really what your management system is about. It's about meeting the requirements of interested parties, of which the organization is one, your employees, your customers, your suppliers, possibly regulatory authorities, that kind of thing. So you must also be looking at these requirements and trying to use objectives as a mechanism to basically see whether you're meeting those. Again, 9001 part specifically really, but there's an equivalent part in the other ones. Be relevant to conformity of products and services and to enhancement of customer satisfaction. So obviously customer satisfaction is a key part of 9001. So it's really again saying that that the objectives should be relevant. They've got to be relevant to what your management system is about and exactly what you're trying to achieve. Must be monitored, so you must be going back to them. You must have some way of measuring them, and you must have some way of keeping an eye on the numbers and an eye on whatever it is you're trying to achieve. And lastly, no, not lastly, penultimately, they should be communicated. So there's no point in having objectives basically if no one knows what the objective is. So if you're trying to achieve something, so in a quality environment, if you're trying to achieve the quality of the product on the shop floor, it's important that the people on the shop floor are aware of the fact that there are objectives and whether they're being met. So this is communication not only of the objectives themselves, but also whether they are being met and whether this is going well. And as we'll see, really, it's a team approach to objectives. It's important to have everybody involved in not only defining them, but also tracking them and deciding what to do if you're not meeting them, because this is very much a feedback mechanism. And that's a key part of objectives too. So lastly, they need to be updated as appropriate. So this not only means that the progress against them need to be updated, but also you may decide to set objectives for a certain period of time. So you may decide to do some objectives for a financial year. It could be that you have some objectives that after a period of time are achieved, and so therefore you want to introduce some more objectives. It's really about turning the screw and making sure that the objectives are working for you to achieve that continual improvement. So updating them not only is updating the objectives themselves that you set, but also updating the list of objectives. So possibly removing ones that you just find don't work for you, that are not having that impact on continual improvement, but also adding in ones that come up as things change. Okay, so that's part of the list of things that are in the standard in terms of what objectives should meet. It's quite a long list, but it gets more. So not only in terms of defining objectives, you also need to plan how you're going to meet these objectives. So it's a fairly basic plan. It's a fairly standard list of things that you would do if you're planning something. But the key thing is that having spent some time defining what your objectives should be, the point is you then need to decide how you're going to meet those objectives. So it's no good defining objectives and then leaving it to fate really to decide whether or not those objectives will be met. What the standard and therefore the auditor is looking for is some kind of structured plan that's going to say, well, okay, what are we going to do? What actions are we going to take to meet these objectives? What resources are going to be required, which is it's a key thing where resources are going to be limited. And it's really a case of, as we come back to a little bit later, how many objectives you have. Spreading those resources around is going to be key to make sure that that you achieve these objectives. Having somebody's name against the objectives as well. An element of when they're going to be done by. So we'll come when we talk about SMART objectives later, that timing is very much a key part of this. So it's no good having open-ended objectives. Again, they need to be time-bound. So we need to know from a planning point of view when we think the objectives are going to be achieved. And lastly, how the results will be evaluated. So what does good look like and how are you going to measure things? Okay, so really that's clause 6.2.2. So really we're talking about here what the standard is saying about objectives. As I say, it's quite a long list. It's an interesting part of the standard. But let's talk a bit about what exactly is an objective. So what I've done here is go back to the ISO list of definitions here, which sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not particularly helpful. And the ISO definition of an objective is a result to be achieved. I'm not going to read all this. You can read this yourself, but basically they're measurable goals to do with your whatever management system you're dealing with. And I appreciate in the audience today we probably have people that are dealing with different standards, whether it's quality, information security, etc. So, and you may be dealing with more than one. So again, you may be implementing say 9001 and 14001 together, in which case you'll be interested in goals in different areas. What's interesting as well is in terms of defining an objective is some of the notes that come with the definition of an objective. So they're not on the screen, but I can read some of these out to you. So ISO is also saying as part of this definition that objectives can relate to different disciplines such as financial, health and safety and environmental objectives, and at different levels such as strategic, organization-wide, project. They also talk about objectives being set at strategic, tactical, or operational level. So we're starting to get an idea here of the fact that objectives are a tool that can apply in many different ways. And one of the challenges with setting your objectives is to decide at which level. Are you going to set them at different levels? Are you going to set them according to processes, to products, etc.? They're a tool that can be applied to many different attributes and aspects of your management system. And the challenge with objectives is to set a certain number of objectives in the right structure so that it's useful and drives continual improvement without making it too hard for yourselves in terms of the amount of resources required to monitor and plan for these things, and also having too many objectives that it becomes unwieldy. It also mentions in the definition that they don't really mind whether you call them objectives, whether you call them targets, goals, etc., aims. It's all the same thing, really. So the terminology, and this is a general point really with the ISO standards, that although certain terminology is used in the standards, they don't mind if you use a different term as long as it basically means the same thing. Okay, one of the things I wanted to mention was what about measuring? So there is clause 9.1 in the standard, which is all about monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation. You will have seen this in the performance side of the standards. So is this the same thing? And the answer is really that the two things are closely related. I would say the key difference, in my opinion, is that an objective requires that we know what good looks like. So a lot of the things with clause 9.1 is about monitoring and measurement and so on. It is about basically understanding trends and understanding what's happening within your organization, but it's not necessarily about setting an objective, because an objective is about continual improvement. So if some aspects of your organization have numbers associated with it, so an example might be in terms of production, you might have a certain number of things that you are producing and you're tracking these numbers. If you don't have a particular goal for production goes up or down, then it could be that an objective is not necessarily appropriate. And there will be a number of things that make sense to measure, but are not necessarily objectives. The likelihood is that you will measure a lot of things. So you'll measure more things than you will set objectives for. But the measurement certainly helps in terms of understanding what trends are, because that's a source potentially of objectives. So you may track lots of things. You may have weekly, monthly, annual reports where there are trend analysis and so on within your organization. But it's a decision. It's a positive decision to actually decide to set an objective in a particular area. And it partly depends on what the trends are. So if the trends are going downhill, then you may decide to use continual improvement to turn that around. So again, it's a case of objectives being a useful tool. One other point I wanted to make was the difference between business objectives and management system objectives. So in terms of the management system, as I said before, we're talking about different types of management system. So we may be talking about a quality management system, environmental, and these equate to the different standards that we mentioned before. So really, ideally, what we're talking about here is setting objectives that are related to the continual improvement of the particular management system itself, not so much business objectives. I guess one of the examples of a business objective might be, say, revenue. So you may have an objective, and most organizations have this, to bring in a certain amount of revenue this year. Usually it's more than last year. And you may again measure, you may track your success against that objective, so again against that business objective. But the point is, it is a business objective. It's not necessarily related to the management system itself. So it is something to bear in mind, really. It's a fine line. It's something that is often discussed in sort of ISO circles in terms of the difference. Certainly when we started doing 9001 internally, it's something that we didn't perhaps fully appreciate at the time. So we set a number of objectives, and we've more recently gone in and we've sort of said, well, okay, which of these are truly quality objectives, and which of these are really business objectives? I say it's a mixture, and it's debatable as to the difference between the two. But ideally, what we're talking about in the context of the standard is objectives to do with the management system, whether that's quality, environmental, etc. So objectives should ideally be SMART. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring all these up at the same time. I appreciate that SMART is something that is a term that's been around for many years. And also, I think if you search on the internet, you'll find many different versions of SMART as well, where the letters mean slightly different things. So this is one interpretation of SMART, but there are particular bits that I think are particularly relevant to this. So specific. So really, in terms of setting your objectives, you need to be specific in the language that you use. What we're trying to do is to be able to tell whether we've met this objective. And if it's too vague, you're never going to be able to do that. And in many respects, there's nothing worse than a vague objective that no one's sure whether they've achieved it, because that affects morale. It affects if you like, the reputation of your objectives. So it needs to be specific, and it needs to be measurable. You need to be able to put some numbers around this. It could be high, medium, low, or it could be some sort of subjective measurement, but there needs to be some aspect of measurability about your objectives as well. They also need to be attainable. So there's no point in setting objectives that are pie in the sky and are never going to be achieved, because they'll always be there, and they aren't really a driver for continual improvement. They could be aspirational, but there's a point where aspirational becomes unattainable effectively. So you need to sort of have 2 feet on the ground, really, in terms of setting your objectives to make sure that they do stay attainable. Realistic, again, sometimes this is another term, but realistic is very similar to attainable, but relevant, I think, is a term that's often used for an R as well, which is probably a better term in my opinion. So the objectives have to be relevant to what you're trying to achieve. There's no point having objectives that are nothing to do with your higher level objectives as quoted in your policy. And lastly, they need to be time bound. So we need to be able to say that we're going to achieve something specific within a certain period of time. And that could be by the end of the year, it could be within a certain period of time. In many respects, it doesn't really matter what it is. And the whole point about these objectives are that it's up to you to decide how you use this as a tool to drive continual improvement. The auditor, from a compliance point of view, will be interested in the fact that you have objectives and that they are relevant and they fit in with your policy and you're tracking them and so on. These are the kind of things. The 2 lists that we looked at earlier, those are the things that the auditor is going to be interested in. It's really up to you as to using your imagination to identify what you think the best objectives are. So let's look at a few examples, simple examples of objectives, because, as I said, you have free range to decide what your objectives are, and you could make them as complicated as you want. Obviously, there's a trade-off between accuracy and degree of complication. But let's have a look at a few simple examples. So the first one is have 3 or fewer reportable data breaches during this financial year. So this is kind of an information security one, I suppose, really, and privacy. So, and again, I'd make the point that you could actually say that, well, you prefer to have no reportable data breaches during this financial year. That's a perfectly valid objective as well, but it's this is really taken into account in a certain size of organization. It's likely you're going to have data breaches. They don't necessarily have to be serious. They could be a case of someone sending personal data to the wrong people on an email, that kind of thing, which does tend to have to be reported. The other key thing with this is reportable. So not all data breaches are reportable. If there's an element of risk associated with it, and say you've used encryption to reduce the risk of a data breach, then it could be that a data breach isn't reportable, in which case it wouldn't meet this requirement. So understanding the terms that you use within your objectives is quite important as well, and possibly having definitions of these terms as well, so that when you come further down the line to decide whether you've met these, then there's no confusion about what exactly it means. Second example, there is an element of user awareness with all of the management systems. So you could have an objective which says that 95% of employees have attended the standard awareness presentation by the end of November 2022. So again, in terms of the smart aspects of this, we're saying it's 95%, it's measurable. We know whether people have attended or not. There's a definition of what they must have attended. It's the standard awareness presentation, and it's also time bound. We're talking by the end of November. So not just November, but the end of November. So we're being pretty specific with that. Again, you could play with this if you wanted to. You could change the figure. It doesn't have to just be employees. It could be contractors and so on as well. It doesn't have to be a standard awareness presentation. It could be you're using some kind of online awareness method as well. So it could be a certain number of courses completed. It's really up to you to decide what's meaningful for you in terms of the objectives, but the principle is that they are well defined. Number 3 example, there are no risks rated high by the end of the calendar year. So risk assessment, again, is a common element of all of these standards. And you may have a qualitative assessment of risks. You may be doing things that way. So you may have high, medium, low risks. So it could be that you have an objective to have taken the treatment actions that you need to take to reduce the risk of something, maybe from high down to medium, by the end of the calendar year or the financial year or within some specified time period. So again, these are the kinds of things that you typically see to do with a management system that you might want to consider. Number 4. Number of widgets produced by the Southampton factory. Now, this has an exclamation mark at the end, basically because this isn't really an objective. Again, going back to my point about measuring versus objectives, this is really a measurement. So we're measuring the number of widgets we produced. We're reasonably specific in terms of the Southampton factory, but there's no element of objectives or what does good look like about that. We're not saying that the number of widgets should be above a certain period. We're just saying this is the number of widgets. So you could set an objective with this if you had to, but just in its raw form, that's an example of something that isn't an objective, but is actually purely a measurement. And the last one, an occupational health and safety example. So you could have an objective to say that all locations have at least one defibrillator by the 31st of August 2023. So again, you'd have to qualify this by having a defined list of locations. So you have to be able to say, and if that list changes during the year, you may have to change your objective. But as long as you've got a list of locations, it's pretty determinable as to whether it's got a defibrillator, and the date is in there as well. We've said at least, so locations could have 2, and that's absolutely fine. So again, that's a reasonably well-rounded example of an objective. Okay, so let's talk about when to measure objectives. So two key things really. The main one is to not forget about your objectives. It's a very easy thing to do, to set your objectives in a frenzy of enthusiasm at the start of the financial year, and then not really go back to them until the next year comes around, or until an audit comes around, and so on. So ideally, you want to keep on top of these and try and be regular in terms of tracking your success against your objectives. Really, it needs to be part of a feedback loop. So your management reviews are important here, your internal audits are important, but you need to be able or you need to be looking at your objectives. First, you need to be satisfied you've got the right objectives and that you can measure them. Then you need to be taking these figures and regularly reporting on them, and then taking action based on what comes back. The old plan, do, check, act Deming cycle that underpins all of these standards. Really, you need to be regularly reporting on these things, and if something starts to go awry, then you can identify that and you can bring it back on track. And you need to avoid surprises as well. So don't wait until some big meeting. What some people do is it depends on the nature of the objective, and again, this comes down to the setting of objectives at different levels. If we have an objective that the high level is to improve some element of quality, for example, and that translates down the levels to almost a daily figure in terms of improvement on a production line, then how often you measure that will vary according to the cascade of that. So where would you find inspiration? So where are you going to find these objectives? There's a number of different places you could look. the entire organization. We mentioned before, you could look at individual functions. So you could look at say the IT function, decide what kind of objectives should we have for IT. You can look at the hierarchy of the organization and sort of start at the policy level and set a high level objective and then reduce that down as we go down the organization. Or you could start with processes as well and decide for each of the individual processes within your management system, what does good look like? How do we know if that process is achieving what it's supposed to achieve? What number would represent that? But in addition to those areas, you could look at the strategic direction of the organization. So where are we actually going as an organization? So therefore, what objectives would help us to define whether we are meeting that? You could look at customer complaints. So from a quality point of view, you would certainly look at customer complaints. So if you're getting complaints on a particular thing, then there may be an issue within your organization. And so it may be something that you really need to look at to set some objectives. So if you're getting lots of complaints about the quality of your goods and so on, goods and services, then you may want to set some objectives to address the particular things that they're complaining about, to really correct that. And again, use that as a driver for continual improvement driven by customer requirements, which from an ISO 9001 point of view is exactly what it's about. Other areas I mentioned internal audit before. So if internal audit is constantly saying this really doesn't meet the needs, then again, that's something that you could start to use objectives as a pinpoint tool to do that. And lastly, business sector best practices. So it could be benchmarking within your industry. It could be just you attend some webinars or conferences, etc., and there's particular things that you think need to be improved that maybe you're not as good at as some other organizations, and so that might be somewhere else. But really, you can look for objectives anywhere, as long as you're happy that they're the correct ones. The word of caution is that don't have too many objectives. It's a difficult one. We often have this discussion about risk assessment as well. What's the right number of risks to have? Well, there isn't really a right number, and similarly, there isn't really a right number of objectives as well. It really depends upon a number of factors within your organization. So one of them is the size of the organization. So larger organizations tend to have more objectives. It depends on the complexity of your organization, and it depends on also how new you are to the management system. So if you're tending to go for certification and you haven't achieved certification yet, my general recommendation would be to keep the number of objectives down a little bit, because otherwise you're making work for yourself. The other thing to consider is resource as well. So as we said before, the requirement of the standard is that you can't just have an objective, you need to have a plan to achieve the objective. And that takes resources, not only in terms of the planning, but also in terms of achieving the planning. So you need to consider what's the right number based on the resources you have and what you're trying to achieve. So it's perfectly acceptable to start with a lower number and then to expand it out as you become certified and as you get more used to doing that. Okay, that's basically what you said. So yeah, so I'm really repeating myself here. So try and keep that down. Okay, so that's a very quick run through of the main points about objectives. Let me just summarize what we're saying about this then. So firstly, it's mandatory. You don't get any choice if you want to become certified to any of these, or if you just want to adopt the relevant standard, then objectives are a very key part of this. You would lump objectives in with things like risk assessment, context, management reviews and internal auditing. It's a key building block of these management systems. And so objectives is something you want to take the time to really understand what structure you should have in your objectives, what the objectives should be. You need to have consultation, and after the consultation, you then need to have communication within the organization. So it's not something you can choose to avoid. Get everybody involved, basically. I mean, as many people as are reasonable with this, and make sure that there's buy-in effectively to the objectives. If you come up with a bunch of objectives that everybody thinks are ridiculous and can never be achieved, then you're not really having any impact there, and it just really gives objectives a bad name. So careful choice of objectives, and also celebration, really, if you achieve the objectives. I mean, it's if you set a reasonable objective and the team achieves it, then there should be some sort of congratulation and celebration that's been achieved, because it's an element of continual improvement. Things are better, things are going in the right direction. As I said before, limit the number of objectives, possibly initially. Put some effort into this and just really try and make sure that the objectives you've got are effective, they're smart, they're meaningful, they're relevant. Everybody buys into the objectives and really feels that if they achieve these objectives, then it does genuinely mean that things have improved and that the management system is delivering what it should be delivering. So objectives are an absolutely key thing to that. If you don't, combined with the whole measurement thing and so on, if you don't measure things and you don't set objectives and you don't track whether you're meeting the objectives, then the management system is kind of adrift, really, and you're not really knowing whether it's having the desired effect. And lastly, from an audit point of view, obviously, those of you who have been audited already will know that the auditor will want to see evidence of all of these things. So you need to make sure the objectives are clearly documented, and that the process of reporting against these objectives is clear, that the action plans to achieve them, you've got something to show the auditor to show that you're making progress towards the achievement of these objectives. And so it's evidence at the end of the day. I mean, everybody will know that that evidence is very key to this. So documentation, records of meetings, progress reports, trend diagrams, and all these kinds of things are very relevant to showing that you've got a good set of objectives and you are taking them seriously and you're really using them. Okay. So a brief word again about how we can help you with this. So we provide toolkits which include talking about objectives and so on, and we have some documents in there that deal with the setting of objectives and the management of those. We have a service where we can make our toolkits tailored to your organization at a single click of a button, basically. We also provide consultancy to help you through the process of setting objectives, and that's often a key thing when we're helping an organization to get to certification. We spend quite a bit of time on setting reasonable objectives as well. And then we can help you further after that with internal auditing on an ongoing basis prior to certification audits, but also as part of the requirements of the standard after that. Okay, let me just have a look, and you have to bear with me a second with this, because we'll have a look at a few questions. Okay, so we have a question in terms of a requirement to have multiple objectives. So the point that's being made is, if we're a young startup, so we have a single software product, could we just have one primary objective, which is to do with incidents around the software? You could. I think a key point about this is when you come to the audit point, or the point of being audited for certification, the auditor will expect to see a certain, and again, it comes back to the number, doesn't it? But a certain number of reasonable objectives around your organization. So I would say the short answer to your question is no. I think having a single objective that is, it may be very, very important to your organization, and that's absolutely fine. It should be an objective. But I think having one, there would be an eyebrow raised, and I think you might get a minor non-conformity to say, or even a major, because it's, I say, objectives is a key part of all of this, to say that you haven't really given due attention to objectives. So I would, if you're a small startup, let me stick my neck out. I mean, I would say you probably want to have of the region of maybe 10 or so objectives. That's a broad brush figure. You can have more. You could have a few less, as long as you could really justify them. You could have maybe sort of half a dozen really good objectives that you can argue to an auditor that they really demonstrate whether your management system and your organization is achieving what it needs to achieve. But one, I think, would be too few. I would look in other areas of the management system and of your business to see what else will be useful as an objective. What processes do you have in addition to the production of the software? I mean, again, it could be, you could be looking at different parts of the software production process. So it could be that, in terms of from an information security point of view, you could have some objectives around vulnerabilities within your software. So it's not really just about incidents. I think also from a point of view of the management system itself. So for example, I don't know, how often are you could have objectives around, say, management buy-in. You could have objectives around risk assessment, and there's a number of different aspects of the management system that that possibly would be good sources of objectives as well. Again, it's a case of picking and choosing the objectives that make sense for you, but that's the key thing. So other typical questions we kind of get, what do we do if we don't meet our objectives? So we set a bunch of sensible objectives and we just find that we're just missing them. Well, that's kind of the point of the objectives to some extent, in that if you're missing them and you have an action plan to achieve them, then something is going wrong somewhere. And if the objective was a reasonable one in the first place, then you might like to look at what could be done to address the situation. That could be more resources, or it could be that perhaps the number was wrong in the first place. So again, going back to the flexibility around objectives, it's really up to you how you use this. So if you set an objective in the first place and you find you're just missing it completely, and you don't think maybe you haven't got more resources to put into it, it could be that you adjust it and you say, well, okay, we said the figure was 10. We're finding that to be completely unrealistic. Going back to the SMART objectives where it should be realistic or attainable, we're finding that 10's just way too high. Let's lower our sights and maybe call it a lower number, with a view to when we achieve that lower number, to then increasing it again as a part of continual improvement. So that is a reasonable thing to do. You have to be careful that you're not just reducing your objectives just for the sake of it. Again, it's a case of defining, and only you really can do this with your knowledge of the business, exactly what level this should be done at. Another question is, what if we can't think of any objectives? Well, as it really comes back to the question about, can I just have one? Well, you do need some objectives. So if you can't think of any, then it's really a case of going back to this point about the policy. So and your requirements of interested parties. Have a look at your interested parties. See what they are, what their interest in your management system, your business is. What would they really want to see being achieved, and start to measure things. It could be also that you take an approach of you start to measure things and then choose from those measurements which of them would make sense to set some objectives. Because I said before, you tend to measure many more things than you set objectives for, but starting with measurement may be a good starting place to then decide, well, okay, we know that the number is 10, but we're at a point now, we've got a better understanding of that. Maybe we should set an objective that we want to bump it up to 12, whatever that attribute is. So again, starting with measurement is a good thing, and looking at the different levels and the functions and the processes as well. It's difficult to believe that if you have a process and a process is designed to turn inputs into outputs, there's usually some kind of measurement and therefore potential objective you can associate with that. So I would think very carefully about that. And the last question, should we have multiple levels of objectives? And I say that's again, it's up to you. You don't have to. Going back to the definition, the ISO definition of objectives, it is a recognized thing that yes, objectives can work in different levels, and it does kind of make sense if you think about it. So you have high-level objectives that might be specified in your policy, and sometimes they can be a bit vaguer. So sometimes there's a process where a sort of an aspirational or more vague objective is stated within your policy, and then as you go down the levels, it becomes more specific until you get to the point where you're really measuring the success of the lower level objectives. You have to be careful, because if your high level objective is really too vague, you're never going to be able to tell whether you've achieved it. It's going to be a very subjective measurement of whether you've achieved it. So be a little careful around that, but there is a little bit of leeway. And the key thing to leave you with on this presentation is objectives are a fantastic tool. It's just a case of deciding how best to apply them as a tool. And if you get it right, and you don't necessarily have to get it right first time, then they can be a really useful way of understanding whether you're achieving something and whether it's working, whether your management system you spent all this time putting in place is really producing the kind of results that you believe it should be producing. Okay, on that positive note, I'd like to thank you very much for attending this webinar. I hope you found it useful. The recording will be available on YouTube and various other places shortly after this. And if you do have any questions, then by all means get in touch with us. We love to have questions and inquiries and so on. So I hope it's been useful, and thank you very much.